And finally this afternoon, it's my pleasure to welcome Dinah Laurillard to the stage, Professor of Learning with Digital Technologies at the London Knowledge Lab. And Dinah, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I was going to begin by asking, why on earth should we be worrying about large-scale student pedagogies? And I think we've just seen why we should be worrying about the large scale and what pedagogy is actually going to mean now. There's a few other numbers as well to worry about. What is the current demand for higher education worldwide? That's currently somewhere like 100 million being estimated, and that's going to increase over the next 10 years or so to even double that number. I don't think that's coming. There it is. Not only that, but the UNESCO goals for primary education are going to be even higher than they were for the Millennium Goals. And this is not quite working. How high do I have to put this? Is that high enough? Okay, post-basic education being expanded to meet the needs of the global economy. So all of those pressures on the needs for higher education mean that we're going to have significant growth in graduate numbers if we're going to do anything like meeting this. Not only that, but it's going to mean an increase also in the number of people who are trained to be primary school educators. So that's another pressure on the growth of graduates. However, in HE currently, our model is something like a 1 to 25 staff-student ratio model. So that's going to get nowhere near coping with those kinds of big numbers. That's something like 4 million teachers we've got to find in a very short time, just to cope with the position that we have now. So remember that one of the things that Richard Maccabee mentioned was the importance of aligning our innovation with corporate goals. And there's nothing like significant growth in graduate numbers as being a corporate goal. So if we can say, look, technology can help with this, then that's one way in which we might be able to align what we're interested in with the corporate goals. So what does that mean in terms of online learning and being able to support new kinds of pedagogies? I've got here a list of the kinds of things that we do online. Not complete, it's a selected list, but let's just go through what they actually mean in terms of the way in which we might support them. We have to look at these in terms of what does it take to support these different kinds of learning. And they're organized approximately according to how much teacher time it takes to prepare those different kinds of online learning. So for things like simulation models and games and things like that, that's very high. That's a very good quality support, but it's very high in terms of preparation. Things like the lecture videos that we just saw some great examples of, that's a lot of high quality, a lot of big preparation time for the teachers. As you get down to these other things, like tutored discussion and comments on e-portfolios, doesn't take a huge amount of time of preparation. But what it does take is support time. And that's the variable cost. Given the number of students you've got to give that kind of support to each one of them. And that's where the pressure on the large-scale pedagogies really comes, because every one of those students needs to be supported with some encouragement, advice, and guidance, and so on. What do MOOCs do? Well, they do the middle ones there, really. They're the ones which are pretty high in terms of preparation time, but they don't really tackle the high support time costs. Whereas the standard online course does all of those. Sorry, moving a bit too fast. The standard online course does all of those, the high preparation costs as well as the high support costs. So what does it take when we're looking at large-scale pedagogy in the context of MOOCs? And we're very fortunate that 1 or 2 places which have done this have given us reports on what it meant to them, on what their details are. It was great to hear that Matthew and Marco were giving us some of their report back on what it took. And it would be nice to go into that in more detail. So here's one example from Duke University in the States. They did a MOOC on bioelectricity. And as you can see, they're not really large scale. They start out at something like 12,000. They pretty rapidly go down. And then you get something like, well, in this case, they got 2% of the enrollment completed and 25% of the engaged, which is pretty much the folk who no, that was supposed to be a... Nope. The folk who completed some quizzes, I mean, that's sort of doing something like engagement. So I think Matthew and Marco achieved something like 7% of completion, so they did a lot better than the Duke University guys did. On the other hand, it's not entirely fair to say that's dropout, because in order to even look and register and see what is on a MOOC, you've got to register. So that registration is really only those people who are thinking, that might be interesting, I'll take a look at that. And that's not really signing up to and engaging in a course. So I think we have to be fairly careful what we mean by dropout when we're talking in terms of MOOCs. Then Edinburgh ran 6 MOOCs last year and have done a very nice report on it. I highly recommend it. And these slides have, in the notes pages of the slides, they have the references to these. And again, they did slightly better on the completion rate. They got something like 10% of enrollment completing and 37% of the engaged who actually did something on the course. So that wasn't too bad. But then we look at the extent to which this is undergraduate education. And for the Duke University, what you see there is that you've got something like 72% of those people who registered are people like us, people with several degrees. On the Edinburgh one, it's 70% of people who have several degrees. For Matthew and Marco, they gave us some very nice data. It looked to me like exactly the same kinds of numbers. So, you know, this is kind of bizarre, because what these universities are doing, at Edinburgh just announced last week, it's spending £1 million on creating half a dozen new MOOCs. This is a lot of money that we're investing in this. Immense staff stress, as we heard. Wonderful story from the front line there. It really was. It was like the stories from the trenches, the war stories. Staff are putting themselves through an immense amount of work. For all these people out there who are paying nothing for their course, not only that, but they complain a lot. On the other hand, we have students on campus in courses who are paying £9,000 a year. And we're spending all this money on these folk out there who are very well educated already and are paying nothing. There is something very weird about what we're doing here. So we say it's all in the name of innovation. Well, fine, OK, but we could innovate with our own students as well. I mean, that wouldn't be a bad thing to do. So let's consider what it takes to teach a MOOC. This is the Edinburgh one, the Duke one. They provided 50 hours of learning time altogether. And they had a lot of preparation time for the... are you actually pushing this forward for me? Yes, you are. OK. OK, thank you. That'll do, but I'll just make sure I'm doing it. So the support time, about 8 hours of that 50 hours. And they also recorded how long it took them to do this. 420 hours of preparation and 200 hours to support that 8 hours. Now remember that in this course, we were down to about 500 students around the end who were really fully engaging. So that's 8 hours for 500 students, that's 4,000 hours. That's, lo and behold, 1:20 staff-student ratio, pretty much. So this is not breaking the mold of how we support high-quality undergraduate education. How does it scale up to large numbers? Well, let's look at what that would be. If we take this graph is showing what it would be to take the 200 hours to support those 500 students and ratcheting it up to say, suppose we did have 2,000, then you were supporting them in the same way with that same kind of pedagogy. That's going to be thousands and thousands of hours of support if you maintain the same pedagogy. And remember what Lindsay said, that what students need is support and encouragement, especially in undergraduate education, especially when you're struggling with difficult ideas, new kinds of high-level skills. It's very tough. So we cannot neglect the pedagogy that we need to be offering to students to nurture their ideas, to take students, which is what you're doing in a higher degree in higher education, to take them to somewhere they have no idea where they need to be going. So it's important then to understand the link between the pedagogical benefits that we're offering students and the teaching time costs of support. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the new digital pedagogies which will do this for us? Just looking at some of the traditional ones that we have, multiple choice questions, not good pedagogically, but concealed multiple choice questions, you have the same answers, but you conceal them from the students. You take user-constructed input. You then ask the student to say which of the following is closest to what you just said. You stop them guessing quite so much. You allow them to think for themselves and then match an answer to theirs, so it's slightly less bad than the pedagogical effects of multiple choice. The Keller plan, nobody remembers the Keller plan, but it was a clever device for dealing with large student numbers where you spend a few minutes introducing the content, maybe 10 minutes. Then you give students study guides or a self-study textbook. They study on their own for 30 minutes or so of the class, and then they take a test. The first one to finish comes up, gets it marked by the tutor, they become a tutor. A couple more finish, they come up and get marked by these two, they become tutors, you've got 4 tutors. By the time you get to the end of the class, you've got half the class marking the other class's work. So that way, you begin to get everybody working at their own pace, and everybody gets a bit of personal attention. It's not perfect, but it is a way of dealing with very large classes and giving everybody a better time than they would have if you tried to take the whole cohort together. So that's something you could try working online. The Vicarious Masterclass. Instead of trying to teach everybody the same way, you take a few students who are kind of representative of the kinds of mistakes students make. It might be something like a music class where you hear how that tutor is saying, don't hold your bow like that, it's making that, try holding it like this, you'll see how the sound is different. Well, that's a vicarious experience for me. I hold my bow like that, I'll try it a different way. That kind of thing could be a very good way of enabling very large numbers of students to vicariously experience the personal tutorial. If you have the pyramid discussion groups, you have very large numbers of students. We used to do this at Open University summer schools. You ask each one to spend 5 minutes answering a question. They then go into pairs, compare answers, come up with an agreed answer. They pair up with another pair. They have to debate their answers and so on. You gradually get larger and larger groups. You get to the point where you then have to say, OK, vote on what these groups say is the best answer. So you could scale that up to tens of thousands of students to the point at which you get out of those tens of thousands of students maybe 10 groups, 10 final analyses of what's the best answer to this question, which the teacher can then comment on. That's feasible. So these are the kinds of ways in which we have traditionally worked on trying to manage large classes. Again, the references are in there. But if we can look at how we redesign some of those for the online format, then we might get somewhere. But how do we do that? How do we get teachers sharing these new kinds of ideas, these new ways of doing things? We don't easily have the means to share our best possible ideas. All day today, there have been some very nice ideas of good ways of doing things. Lindsay had one in her talk about a different way of doing a field trip, something like that. Now, that's a pedagogic idea I would like to capture and use in my own teaching, adapt it to what I'm doing. This is what this tool is designed to do. Create a tool for teachers to use to help them with the creative knowledge that we now need to develop on how to do these effective pedagogies for large classes. So the Pedagogical Patterns Collector, the URL is there. You can follow it through. It's basically a tool in which you can browse through some an existing library of designs that other people have already done. It represents here the kind of metadata that you've got to describe those things in terms of learning type, group size, duration, and so on, so that you've got a very explicit description of what your pedagogy is and the kinds of resources attached and where it's located and so on. This is where it's designed, and you can have on this page either you're adopting something and then you're adapting it, so you're changing some of these things like adjusting the type of learning activity, editing the instructions, changing the duration. And as you do all that, you can see what kind of a learning activity overall you're creating. Have you got an enormous amount of just talking head, or have you got a reasonable amount of student activity and so on? So you get some kind of feedback on the pedagogic value of what you're doing. Then, because all of this is actually data that the computer is capable of understanding, This is a computational object that can be exported, e.g. to Moodle. And we have a project which is doing that now, and the programmer says, yes, yes, there'll be no problem. We'll be there with you at the end of the month, and I'm just crossing everything to hope it will be. Or you can export it to Word, and most importantly, you can share it with others. So what happens when you do that? It's picking up on what, hang on, Kevin Ashley was saying. When he was saying, in a research context, I can pick up bits of what you do. Now, that's exactly what we do in scientific research. We never just pitch in and do our own thing privately behind closed doors. That is what we do in teaching. If we could, in teaching, build on good ideas from other people, go and see what they've done, take that, adopt it, do our own thing with it, experiment with it, find something better, give it back, then we are also acting in the teaching context the way that researchers do in the scientific context. So here is that pattern exported to Moodle. And it interprets all that data, attaches the right resources, puts it into some kind of Moodle context. However, that same pattern, which is about optimizing inputs to a learning design tool in order to achieve some particular output, and with your partner, wait. With your partner, selecting certain inputs to change what you're doing, and now converting just the content, the subject content detail of that. All the pedagogy stays the same. So there's a good pedagogic idea of how you might help students do this, but we're using different resources. We've got a slightly different goal, but essentially the pedagogy is the same kind of thing. And that then equally exports to Moodle, so that instead of your education version, you've got now a medical version doing much the same sort of thing, but it's linking into different URLs, linking into a different simulation. So it's the same pedagogical pattern, the same study guidance, but the content terms are different. So that kind of tool can help us with that kind of parameterization of the content bits, the bits that do have to change, but the migration of the good pedagogy. And I think it was, yes, it was Nicola who was saying, we do not share as much as we should. Well, it was in a slightly different context, but it's certainly true in teaching. And we certainly need to do that, the more that we're moving into to new digital pedagogies. So by modeling the benefits and by having that kind of analysis of, so what kind of a teaching situation have you created, we can compare one with another. And we should be seeing, as we move online, that we're getting more active learning than we had when we were doing it the old-fashioned way. Those should be the kinds of benefits that we're expecting to see. What about the teaching time? Coming back to that large scale, what happens when we increase student numbers? This is not the way that people normally think within universities, because we know how much teaching costs, and it's got that part of the budget line, and then something goes on there that we don't know much about, but we assume it will work. Now, if we're moving online, first of all, we have to do a lot more preparation up front, so the annual cost of teaching changes, because you get a large amount which then you amortize over later years. And you also have to think about, if you're scaling up numbers, and we're scaling up the same pedagogy, how much is that going to cost us to actually run? So this is an example of how we put this through what we call the course resource appraisal model, with the handy acronym of CRAM, to see what it means for our teachers. So here was one example of the first run-through of a course, thinking about what they were going to do. They're going to run it for 40 students every year, and you can see that you make a big loss the first year because you're doing a lot of preparation, and then you begin to build up a very minor profit by the end. If, on the other hand, you run it with increasing numbers of students, then that high preparation cost is amortizing over much larger numbers of students, and you've got very high support costs, but on the other hand, you've got a lot of income coming in. So as long as you're keeping that same kind of 1 to 25 ratio, you can still do it. What's difficult is that you need to model the differences in the administrative support, because you've now got a lot of tutors to find and recruit and pay and change, and there are other kinds of systems around it. So it's not just teaching that's going to get affected by the large scale. And what that means is that we've really got to face some of the uncomfortable truths here. And these are truths that I'm afraid our finance directors are not really aware of and are not really addressing. So we have to help them with that. And the people in this room are probably among the best people to try and help universities do that. What they need to know is that scaling up to larger numbers will never improve per student support costs, those variable costs, the things you have to do for every single student as a teacher, to nurture them, to encourage them, to give them feedback, to mark their papers. That's a large part of what university education is about. But we might come up with some good pedagogical ideas, use the technology well, and find some of those ways in which we can do good large-scale pedagogy. But that means we need to invest in teaching innovation to be able to make much better use of our teaching resource for students' outcomes. So teachers sharing innovations will be able to improve that knowledge and the quality and the value for students' money if we're equipped to invest in that and get the real benefit of it. So as Kathy said, senior leaders should be modeling what they expect from their staff. Unfortunately, I don't think they can model the effects, the value of new technology, because on most of our senior teams, they are not fully aware of what technology can do. On every senior team, there should be somebody asking, how can technology help? Whose job it is to say, this is what we could be doing. And we are the people who have to be pushing that. So there's some places you can follow up further. Just wanted to mention, although Alicia again was talking about open access with research, what we're doing in our Building Community Knowledge project through these kinds of tools is enabling teachers to do that kind of open access sharing as well. So to finalize, the global demand requires investment in this large-scale pedagogic innovation. We've got to do better than 1 to 25. That's what that means. We need to give the teachers the tools to test and share and design and play with what it means to do it, not just in the context of MOOCs, because teachers are the engine of innovation. They're the ones who are designing and testing and sharing their best pedagogic ideas. And they're the ones who really need your help to do it. I'm sure I've got one more quote there. Yes, the World Wide Web is coming. So there are going to be those millions of students out there who do need access to education. We've got to tackle this large-scale demand. We've got to find better ways of doing it. What else can do it except technology? Technology is good at the large scale. But unless we get that concept of sharing, of understanding where the teaching cost is, of understanding what it takes to support teaching innovation, we're not going to do it. But you're the folk who will help us do it. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Diana. That's wonderful.